The Australian outback is amazing. It is a land of contrast, from inland lakes and rivers to wide open spaces. We have just come back from a 3,200 kilometre trip circumnavigating the state of New South Wales in my standard range Tesla Model Y. Travelling the remote and harsh Australian outback in an electric vehicle proved to be easy and comfortable. In this video, I'll outline what it's like travelling in remoter parts of Australia, as well as cover charging along the way. I'll also touch on highlights of the trip. Hi, I'm John. Welcome to the channel. On day one, we travelled from Sydney to Cobar. First charging stop was at Orange at the Tesla supercharger. We needed enough charge to get to the next charging point, which was Nyngan. This was going to take 30 minutes, so while charging, we headed to the supermarket to stock our camping fridge. We headed to Nyngan to the NRMA 50 kilowatt DC charger, where we plugged in to get enough charge to get us to our final stop today at Cobar. We plugged in and went for a walk around town. Back on the road, and it wasn't long before we rolled into Cobar. We checked into a motel and charged the car at an NRMA 50 kilowatt DC charger while we had dinner at the pub. After dinner, we unplugged and went and had a look around the Cobar gold mine. The next day, we would travel via Broken Hill to the Cobar National Park. We intended to camp, but looking at the temperatures coming up, we decided we needed to stay in air conditioning at the shearers' quarters cabins within the national park instead. I used PlugShare to check the charging along the way for the day. The only DC charger in Broken Hill had a hardware problem. Looking on PlugShare, I could see that there was an AC Type 2 charger available instead. A lot slower, but will work. Back on the road to our first charging stop of Wilcannia, we noted a lot of goats on the side of the road. Arriving at Wilcannia, we plugged into a 50 kilowatt NRMA DC charger. We were going to be here for an hour. We took the opportunity to have our breakfast in the park across the road and also took a look at the Darling River passing through the town. Back on the road to Broken Hill, the landscape changed to flatness. Arriving into Broken Hill, we charged at the Type 2 charger. The charging rate was 11 kilowatts, so it was going to take 2 hours to give us enough charge to get us to our destination. I did check the status of the NRMA DC fast charger that had the hardware problem. It was only charging at a 10 kilowatt rate, same as what we're getting at the Type 2. I made a comment on PlugShare to that effect for fellow EV users. We headed off to Cobar National Park. As we turned into the park, the bitumen stops and the dirt road starts. It was compacted sand, which was no problem, though in parts there were corrugations, and here I slowed down to 30 kilometres an hour. We arrived at the shearers' quarters and we had the entire place to ourselves. I booked room 3, which allowed me to run an extension cord from the room power point out to the car for charging. The 2 kilowatt charge rate means you add 14 kilometres of range every hour, which is fine for overnight charging. The next morning we had 68% charge, which was ample for travelling around the day. We intended to travel around the Cobar National Parks. The roads were compacted dirt and sand roads, which was fine to travel on with the Tesla Y. We came across plenty of wildlife. We saw pelicans in the Darling River as well as on land. There were a couple of emus that were very inquisitive towards us, taking their time to cross the road. We then headed to take a look at the Amaru Lake. The road was corrugated, so we kept our speed low. We arrived at the Burke and Wills camp where birds were feeding off fish coming through the weir. We had lunch by the lake. The drone imagery shows this to be a huge lake. We travelled to another weir nearby. Bird life at this weir were also feeding off the fish coming through it. Arriving back at the shearers' quarters, it was 40 degrees centigrade, and we made the decision to travel to Broken Hill. Getting a top-up charge from the standard mains power point was slow. We aim to charge to a point that will get us to Broken Hill with 2% charge remaining. We headed off and got a warning shortly after to stay below 90 kilometres per hour. Arriving at Broken Hill with 3% charge, we plugged into the Type 2 AC charger there. As we were staying in a motel around the corner, I left the car there overnight to charge to 100%. We had a few days in Broken Hill and the next day decided to do a day trip out to Fowler's Gap. After picking up the car, we did a little sightseeing around Broken Hill. The mining heritage in this community is long and deep, with many miners losing their lives over the decades. We set off along the Silver City Highway. All roads were open. You can really feel the remoteness out here. We stopped by a dried out creek bed. We arrived at the University of New South Wales Fowler's Gap Arid Zone Research Station, where my wife had some brief work to do. I said hello to a few of the locals. We headed back to Broken Hill and had dinner, and then a little more sightseeing as the temperatures had dropped a little in the evening. The next day we headed out to Silverton, which is an old mining town. Silverton is where the movie Mad Max 2 was filmed, so it wasn't surprising to see a museum and props from the movie. Just out of Silverton was a very remote area where a lot of the filming for the Mad Max movie took place. Arriving back at Broken Hill, the temperature was now up to 43 degrees centigrade. Despite that, we had dinner and did a little more sightseeing. The southbound leg from Broken Hill down to Mildura was the longest of the trip, at 296 kilometres, and the most remote. There's nothing much from Broken Hill till you get down near Mildura. The weather was showing a 29 km/h wind from the south, so, as a large headwind, we took the precaution of charging up to 100% before we left Broken Hill. The Tesla calculated we would arrive with 5% charge remaining. We had a warning to remain below 105 km/h if we wanted to arrive with 5%. We set off aware that we would have to closely monitor energy usage. It wasn't long before we got the message to stay below 100 km/h. We rolled along at 95 km/h to minimize energy, even though we could do 110 on this road. This is called hypermiling. Cars came up behind us and overtook us, as you would expect. We kept 95 km/h up for about an hour till we could see improvement, with the expectation to now arrive with 6% charge remaining. We stopped for a break halfway, stretched our legs and said hello to the locals. Back on the road, we picked up our speed up to 100 km/h, slowing down occasionally for wildlife. Our energy situation deteriorated, now showing arriving with 2% charge remaining, so we dropped back to 95 km/h. So it seems that 95 km/h is about the best that we could maintain against the headwind. Surprising the impact on range that headwinds have on EVs. It's probably safer going slower anyway with all the wildlife on the side of the road. We crossed over the border into Victoria and not long after reversed up to a Tesla supercharger with 3% charge remaining. It was great to plug into a DC fast charger. 171 kilowatts adds 1,200 kilometres range per hour. As we charged, we got some lunch. Next charging stop was Oyen, which had a couple of 150 kilowatt NRMA DC fast chargers. I needed enough charge to get me to Pink Lakes at Crosby Camping Ground and back to this charger. So once I saw that I could get back with 10% remaining, I unplugged and headed off. The last few kilometres before the Pink Lakes was on an unsealed road. Pink Lakes is a salt lake that runs pink undertones under the right conditions at sunset. As it turned out, we had the whole place to ourselves. We eagerly awaited sunset to see the change of colour of the salt lake. It wasn't long till we ventured out onto the lake and saw an amazing change of colour take place. The next morning, we woke to an amazing sunrise. We packed up and headed off to the NRMA DC fast charger at Oyen. Heading to Wagga, we passed through the plains at Hay, which is amazingly flat. We topped up at a Tesla supercharger at Hay. While charging, we took the opportunity to make lunch out of the back of the car. We arrived at Wagga and charged at the Wagga Wagga Tesla supercharger before heading off to a motel. The next day was a short leg across to Tumut. Before leaving Wagga, we did some sightseeing though. At Tumut, we set up camp next to the Tumut River. It was such a contrast now to be in a cool, green place. We would spend a lot of time swimming in the river. This particular caravan park has Type 2 charging infrastructure on site. As we're on a powered site, we did not need to use it and chose to charge from a standard caravan 15 amp socket on the camping site. Charge rate is 3 kilowatts, which is slow. Each morning though, the car would be at 100% charge. Each day would do day trips from Tumut. The Snowy hydroelectric scheme is an impressive piece of engineering. We visited the Kosciuszko National Park to look at caves scattered throughout the park. There was even a thermal pool there. On the last day, we packed up and headed to Sydney. There was only one charging stop on the 5-hour drive, and that was at an Exeter Tesla supercharger. As we approached, we saw the bank of superchargers was occupied. There was a waiting time. We elected to use an EV 350 kilowatt charger instead. We charged for 25 minutes, had some lunch, and drove the remaining leg home to Sydney. So that was a quick 10-day trip. See below for a link to my working spreadsheet that shows charging stops and other information relating to the drive. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video.